When the blood was washed away, the wrist wound proved very slight, and Gilman puzzled over the location of the two tiny punctures. It occurred to him that there was no blood on the bedspread where he had lain, which was very curious in view of the amount on his skin and cuff. Had he been sleepwalking within his room, and had the rat bitten him as he sat in some chair, or paused in some less rational position? He looked in every corner for brownish drops or stains, but did not find any. He had better, he thought, sprinkle flour within the room as well as outside the door. Though, after all, no further proof of his sleepwalking was needed. He knew he did walk, and the thing to do now was to stop it. He must ask Frank Elwood for help. This morning, the strange pulls from space seemed lessened, though they were replaced by another sensation even more inexplicable. It was a vague, insistent impulse to fly away from his present situation, but held not a hint of the specific direction in which he wished to fly. As he picked up the strange spiky image on the table, he thought the older northward pull grew a trifle stronger. But even so, it was wholly overruled by the newer and more bewildering urge. He took the spiky image down to Elwood's room, steeling himself against the winds of the loom fixer which welled up from the ground floor. Elwood was in, thank heaven, and appeared to be stirring about. There was time for a little conversation before leaving for breakfast and college, so Gilman hurriedly poured forth an account of his recent dreams and fears. His host was very sympathetic and agreed that something ought to be done. He was shocked by his guest's drawn, haggard aspect, and noticed the queer, abnormal-looking sunburn which others had remarked during the past week. There was not much, though, that he could say. He had not seen Gilman on any sleepwalking expedition, and had no idea what the curious image could be. He had, though, heard the French-Canadian who lodged just under Gilman talking to Maser Wickes one evening. They were telling each other how badly they dreaded the coming of Walpurgis night. Now, only a few days off, and were exchanging pitying comments about the poor, doomed young gentleman. Desrockers, the fellow under Gilman's room, had spoken of nocturnal footsteps, shod and unshod, and of the violet light he saw one night when he had stolen fearfully up to peer through Gilman's keyhole. He had not dared to peer, he told Maser Wickes, after he'd glimpsed that light through the cracks around the door. There had been soft talking too, and as he began to describe it, his voice had sunk to an audible whisper. Elwood could not imagine what had set these superstitious creatures gossiping, but supposed their imaginings had been roused by Gilman's late hours and somnolent walking and talking on the one hand, and by the nearness of traditionally feared May Eve on the other hand. That Gilman talked in his sleep was plain. It was obviously from Desrocher's keyhole listenings that the delusive notion of the violet dreamlight had got abroad. These simple people were quick to imagine they had seen any odd thing they had heard about. As for a plan of action, Gilman had better move down to Elwood's room and avoid sleeping alone. Elwood would, if awake, rouse him whenever he began to talk or rise in his sleep. Very soon, too, he must see the specialist. Meanwhile, they would take to the spiky image around the various instruments. around to the various museums and to certain professors seeking identification and stating that it had been found in a public rubbish can. Also, Dombrowski must attend to the poisoning of those rats in the walls, braced up by Elwood's companionship. Gilman attended classes that day. Strange urges still tugged at him, but he could sidetrack them with considerable success. During a free period, he showed the queer image to several professors, all of whom were intensely interested, though none of them could shed any light upon its nature or origin. That night he slept on a couch, which Elwood had the landlord bring to the second-story room, and for the first time in weeks was wholly free from disquieting dreams. But the feverishness still hung on, and the whines of the loom fixer were an unnerving influence. During the next few days, Gilman enjoyed an almost perfect immunity from morbid manifestations. He had, Elmwood said, showed no tendency to talk or rise in his sleep, and meanwhile the landlord was putting rat poison everywhere. The only disturbing element was the talk among the superstitious foreigners, whose imaginations had become highly excited. Mazurwieckas was always trying to make him get a crucifix, and finally forced one upon him, which he said had been blessed by the good Father Iwaniki. Desrochers, too, had something to say. In fact, he insisted that cautious steps had sounded in the now vacant room above him on the first and second nights of Gilman's absence from it. Paul Choinsky thought he heard sounds in the halls and on the stairs at night, and claimed that his door had been softly tried, while Mrs. Dombrowski vowed she had seen Brown Jenkin for the first time since All Hallows. But such naive reports could mean very little, and Gilman let the cheap metal crucifix hang idly from a knob on his host's dresser. For 3 days, Gilman and Elwood canvassed the local museums in an effort to identify the strange, spiky image, but always without success. In every quarter, however, interest was intense, for the utter alienage of the thing was a tremendous challenge to scientific curiosity. One of the small radiating arms was broken off and subjected to chemical analysis. Professor Ellery found platinum, iron, and tellurium in the strange alloy, but mixed with these were at least 3 other apparent elements of high atomic weight, which chemistry was absolutely powerless to classify. Not only did they fail to correspond with any known element, but they did not even fit the vacant places reserved for probable elements in the periodic table. The mystery remains unsolved to this day, though the image is on exhibition at the Museum of Miskatonic University. On the morning of April 27th, a fresh rat hole appeared in the room where Gilman was a guest, but Dombrowski tinned it up during the day. The poison was not having much effect, for scratchings and scurryings in the walls were virtually undiminished. Elwood was out late that night, and Gilman waited up for him. He did not wish to go to sleep in a room alone, especially since he thought he had glimpsed in the evening twilight the repellent old woman whose image had become so horribly transferred to his own dreams. He wondered who she was, and what had been near her rattling the tin can in a rubbish heap at the mouth of a squalid courtyard. The crone had seemed to notice him and leer evilly at him, though perhaps this was merely his imagination. The next day both youths felt very tired, and knew they would sleep like logs when the night came. In the evening they drowsily discussed the mathematical studies which had so completely and perhaps harmfully engrossed Gilman, and speculated about the linkage with ancient magic and folklore, which seemed so darkly probable. They spoke of old Keziah Mason, and Elwood agreed that Gilman had good scientific grounds for thinking she might have stumbled on the strange and significant information. Can't do videos out here without getting bit by bugs, or at least have them crawl on me. The hidden cults to which these witches belonged often guarded and handed down surprising secrets from elder, forgotten eons. And it was by no means impossible that Keziah had actually mastered the art of passing through dimensional gates. Tradition emphasizes the uselessness of material barriers in halting a witch's motions, and who can say what underlies the old tales of broomstick rides through the night? Whether a modern student could ever gain similar powers from mathematical research alone was still to be seen. Success, Gilman added, might lead to dangerous and unthinkable situations, for who could foretell the conditions pervading an adjacent but normally inaccessible dimension? On the other hand, the picturesque possibilities were enormous. Time could not exist in certain belts of space, and by entering and remaining in such a belt, one might preserve one's life and age indefinitely, never suffering organic metabolism or deterioration except for slight amounts incurred during visits to one's own similar planes. One might, for example, pass into a timeless dimension and emerge at some remote period of Earth's history as young as before. Whether anybody had ever managed to do this, one could hardly conjecture with any degree of authority. Old legends are hazy and ambiguous, and in historic times all attempts at crossing forbidden gaps seem complicated by strange and terrible alliances with beings and messengers from outside. There was the immemorial figure of the deputy or messenger of hidden and terrible powers, the Black Man of the witch cult, and Nyarlathotep of the Necronomicon. There was, too, the baffling problem of the lesser messengers or intermediaries, quasi-animals, and queer hybrids, which legend depicts as witches, familiars, and Gilman and Elwood retired too, sleepily, to argue further. They heard Joe Mazurwick's reel into the house, half drunk, and shuddered at the desperate wildness of his whining prayers. That night, Gilman saw the violet light again. In his dream, he had heard a scratching and a gnawing in the partitions, and thought that someone fumbled clumsily at the latch. Then he saw the old woman and the small furry thing advancing toward him over the carpeted floor. The beldame's face was alight with inhuman exultation, and the little yellow-toothed morbidity tittered mockingly as it pointed at the heavily sleeping form of Elwood on the other couch across the room. A paralysis of fear stifled all attempts to cry out. As once before, the hideous crone seized Gilman by the shoulders, yanking him out of bed and into empty space. Again the infinitude of the shrieking abysses flashed past him, but in another second he thought that he was in a dark, muddy, and unknown alley of foetid odor, with the rotting walls of ancient houses towering up on every hand. Ahead was the robed Black Man he had seen in the peaked space in the other dream, while from a lesser distance the old woman was beckoning and grimacing imperiously. Brown Jenkin was rubbing itself with a kind of affectionate playfulness around the ankles of the Black Man, which the deep mud largely concealed. There was a dark open doorway on the right, to which the Black Man silently pointed. Into this the grinning crone started, dragging Gilman after her by his pajama sleeves. There were evil-smelling staircases which creaked ominously, and on which the old woman seemed to radiate a faint violet light, and finally a door leading off a landing. The crone fumbled with the latch and pushed the door open, motioning to Gilman to wait, and disappearing inside the black aperture. The youth's oversensitive ears caught a hideous, strangled cry, and presently the beldame came out of the room bearing a small, senseless form which she thrust at the dreamer as if ordering him to carry it. The sight of this form and the expression on its face broke the spell. Still too dazed to cry out, he plunged recklessly down the noisome staircase and into the mud outside, halting only when seized and choked by the waiting black man. As consciousness departed, he heard the faint and shrill tittering of a fanged, rat-like abnormality. On the morning of the 29th, Gilman awakened into a maelstrom of horror. The instant he opened his eyes, he knew something was terribly wrong, for he was back in his old garret room, with the slanting wall and ceiling, sprawled on the now unmade bed. His throat was aching inexplicably, and as he struggled into a sitting posture, he saw, with growing fright, that his feet and pajama bottoms were brown with caked mud. For the moment his recollections were hopelessly hazy, but he knew at least he must have been sleepwalking. Elwood had been lost too deeply in slumber to hear and stop him. On the floor were confused, muddy prints, but oddly enough, they did not extend all the way to the door. The more Gilman looked at them, the more peculiar they seemed, for in addition to those he could recognize as his, there were some smaller, almost round markings, such as the legs of a large chair or table might make, except that most of them tended to be divided into halves. There were also some curious, muddy rat tracks leading out of a fresh hole and back into it again. Utter bewilderment and the fear of madness racked Gilman as he staggered to the door and saw that there was no muddy prints outside. The more he remembered of his hideous dream, the more terrified he felt, and it added to his desperation to hear Joe Mazurwiecki's chanting mournfully 2 floors below. You don't have to yell your prayers so bad you can hear through 2 floors and all that stuff. Same thing with your televisions and all that stuff. You don't need to be so loud. Just pay close attention, do a little, just don't try to drone yourself out with whatever. Descending to Elwood's room, he roused his still sleeping host and began telling of how he had found himself, but Elwood could form no idea of what might really have happened, where Gilman could have been, how he got back to his room without making tracks in the hall, and how the muddy furniture-like prints came to be mixed with his in the garret chamber, were wholly beyond conjecture. And then there were those dark, livid marks on his throat, as if he had tried to strangle himself. He put his hands up to them, but found that they did not even approximately fit. While they were talking, Desrochers dropped in to say that he had heard a terrific clattering overhead in the dark small hours. No, there had been no one on the stairs after midnight, though just before midnight he had heard faint footsteps in the garret, and cautiously descending steps he did not like. It was, he added, a very bad time of the year for Arkham. The young gentleman had better be sure to wear the crucifix Joe Mazurwiecki had given him. Even the daytime was not safe, for after dawn there had been strange sounds in the house, especially a thin, childish wail, hastily choked off. Gilman mechanically attended classes that morning, but was wholly unable to fix his mind on his studies. A mood of hideous apprehension and expectancy had seized him, and he seemed to be awaiting the fall of some annihilating blow. At noon he lunched at the university spa, picking up a paper from the next seat as he waited for dessert. But he never ate that dessert, for an item on the paper's first page left him limp, wide-eyed, and able only to pay his check and stagger back to Elwood's room. There had been a strange kidnapping on the night before in Orrin's gangway, and the 2-year-old child of a clod-like laundry worker named Anastasia Walejko had completely vanished from sight. The mother, it appeared, had feared the event for some time, but the reasons she assigned for her fear were so grotesque that no one took them seriously. She had, she said, seen Brown Jenkin about the place now, and then, ever since early in March, and knew from its grimaces and titterings that little Ladislas must be marked for sacrifice at the awful Sabbath on Walpurgis night. She had asked her neighbor Mary Ksanek to sleep in the room and to try to protect the child, but Mary had not dared. She could not tell the police, for they never believed such things. Children had been taken that way every year ever since she could remember, and her friend, Pete Stowacki, would not help because he wanted the child out of the way. Even if you don't like someone's kid, that's no. But what threw Gilman into a cold perspiration was the report of a pair of revelers who had been walking past the mouth of the gangway just after midnight. They admitted that they had been drunk, but they both vowed that they had seen a crazily dressed trio furtively entering the dark passageway. There had, they said, been a huge robed Negro, a little old woman in rags, and a young white man in his night clothes. The old woman had been dragging the youth, while around the feet of the Negro a tame rat was rubbing and weaving in the brown mud. Gilman sat in a daze all the afternoon, and Elwood, who had meanwhile seen the papers and formed terrible conjectures from them, found him thus when he came home. This time neither could doubt that, but that something hideously serious was closing in around them. Between the phantasms of nightmare and the realities of the objective world, a monstrous and unthinkable relationship was crystallizing, and only stupendous vigilance could avert the still more direful developments. Gilman must see a specialist sooner or later, but not just now, when all the papers were full of this kidnapping business. Just what had really happened was maddeningly obscure, and for a moment both Gilman and Elwood exchanged whispered theories of the wildest kind. Had Gilman unconsciously succeeded better than he knew in his studies of space and its dimensions? Had he actually slipped outside our sphere to points unguessed and unimaginable? Where, if anywhere, had he been on those nights of demoniac alienage? The roaring twilight abysses, the green hillside, the blistering terrace, the pools from the stairs, the ultimate black vortex, the black man, the muddy alley and the stairs, the old witch and the fanged furry horror, the bubble conjuries and the little polyhedron, the strange sunburn, the wrist wound and the unexplained image, the muddy feet, the throat marks, the tales and fears of the superstitious foreigners. What did this all mean? To what extent could the laws of sanity apply to such a case? Now, when they say the black man in the myths, that this is obviously inspiring, I would think. Perhaps his nightmarish experience, his nightmares and night visions. But, H.P. Lovecraft's, but they say black man, but it's not really, it's like a human, but not quite like a human, This is just the best way to describe it. As he said, not without negroid features we're talking about. There was no sleep for either of them that night, but the next day they both cut classes and drowsed. This was April 13th, and with the dusk would come the hellish Sabbath time, which all the foreigners and the superstitious old folk feared. Mazur Wicks came home at 6 o'clock and said people at the mill were whispering that the Walpurgis revels would be held in the dark ravine beyond Meadow Hill, where the old white stone stands in a place queerly devoid of all plant life. Some of them had even told the police and advised them to look there for the missing Walejko child, but they did not believe anything would be done. Joe insisted that the poor young gentleman wear his nickel chain crucifix, and Gilman put it on and dropped it inside his shirt to humor the fellow. Yeah, a lot of persecution of people with different beliefs still goes on in this country. They're going to blaspheme the Christian holidays, get them. Seriously, there are people that are just like that. Late at night, the two youths sat drowsing in their chairs, lulled by the praying of the loom fixer on the floor below. Gilman listened as he nodded. His preternaturally sharpened hearing seemed to strain for some subtle, dreaded murmur. beyond the noises in the ancient house, unwholesome recollections of things in the Necronomicon and the Black Book welled up, and he found himself swaying to infamous rhythms said to pertain to the blackest ceremonies of the Sabbat, and to have an origin outside the time and space we comprehend. Presently he realized what he was listening for, the hellish chant of the celebrants in the distant Black Valley. How did he know so much about what they expected? How did he know what time, when Nahab and her acolyte were due to bear the brimming bowl which would follow the black cock and the black goat? Rooster. And some would also include a black cat or a black dog or something with, edible animals we're seeing here. He saw that Elwood had dropped asleep and tried to call out and waken him. Something, however, closed his throat. He was not his own master. Had he signed the black man's book after all? Well, you don't have to. You can change your religion, thank you very much. Or that's really what making a pact is. You don't have to bleed on a book or, be dragged through the night by, Then his fevered, abnormal hearing caught the distant, wind-borne notes. Over miles of hill and field and alley they came. But he recognized them nonetheless. The fires must be lit, and the dancers must be starting in. How could he keep himself from going? What was it that had enmeshed him? Mathematics? Folklore? The house? Old Kezia? Brown Jenkin? And now he saw that there was a fresh rat-hole in the wall near his couch, above the distant chanting and the nearer praying of Joe Mazur. Wickes came another sound, a stealthily determined scratching in the partitions. He hoped the electric lights would not go out. Then he saw the fanged, bearded little face in the rat hole. The accursed little face, which he at last realized bore such a shocking, mocking resemblance to old Kezia's, and heard the faint fumbling at the door. The screaming twilight abysses flashed before him, and he felt himself helpless in the formless grasp of the iridescent bubble conjuries. Ahead raced the small kaleidoscopic polyhedron, and all through the churning void there was a heightening and acceleration of the vague tonal pattern, which seemed to foreshadow some unutterable and unendurable climax. He seemed to know what was coming, what monstrous burst of Walpurgis rhythm in whose cosmic timber would be concentrated all the primal, ultimate space-time seethings which lie behind the massed spheres of matter and sometimes break forth in measured reverberations that penetrate faintly to every corner of entity and give hideous significance throughout the worlds to certain dreaded periods. But all this vanished in a second. He was again in the cramped, violet-litten, peaked space, with the slanting floor, the low case of ancient books, the bench and table, the queer objects, and the triangular gulf at one side. And on the table lay a small white figure, an infant boy, unclothed and unconscious, while on the other side stood the monstrous, leering old woman, with a gleaming, grotesque, hafted knife in her right hand, and a queerly proportioned, pale metal bowl covered with curiously chased designs, and having delicate lateral handles in her left. She was intoning some croaking ritual in a language which Gilman could not understand, but which seemed like something guardedly quoted in the Necronomicon. As the scene grew clearer, he saw the ancient crone bend forward and extend the empty bowl across the table, and unable to control his own emotions, he reached far forward and took it into both hands, noticing as he did so its comparative lightness. At the same moment, the disgusting form of Brown Jenkin scrambled up over the brink of the triangular black gulf on his left. The crone now motioned him to hold the bowl in a certain position while she raised the huge, grotesque knife above the small white victim as high as her right hand could reach. The fanged, furry thing began tittering, a continuation of the unknown ritual, while the witch croaked loathsome responses. Gilman felt a gnawing, poignant abhorrence shoot through the mental and emotional paralysis, and the light metal bowl shook in his grasp. A second later, the downward motion of the knife broke the spell completely, and he dropped the bowl with a resounding bell-like clangor, while his hands darted out frantically to stop the monstrous deed. In an instant, he had edged up the slanting floor around the ends of the table, and wrenched the knife from the old woman's claws, sending it clattering over the brink of the narrow triangular gulf. In another instant, however, the matters were reversed, for those murderous claws had locked themselves tightly around his own throat, while the wrinkled face was twisted with insane fury. He felt the chain of the cheap crucifix grinding into his neck, and in his peril wondered how the sight of the object itself would affect the evil creature. Her strength was altogether superhuman, but as she continued her choking, he reached feebly in his shirt and drew out the metal symbol, snapping the chain and pulling it free. And I'm going to get a noose. I found something to wear from the chain that maybe you'll see before you see this video.